Happy Lord's Day. Today's Bible passage is from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. Genesis 18, 1 through 15, and I'll be reading from verses 2 to 5. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So with this passage, I'll be preaching on Abraham's love. So the title for today's message is Abraham's Love. Since chapter 15, we discussed about how God made covenant with Abraham by having animals cut in pieces. Then we proceeded to chapter 17, where Abraham and every man in his household were circumcised. And chapter 18 and 19 depicts the way of life of those who are in the covenant of circumcision and those who are not. And today's passage talks about how those who are in the covenant of circumcision live their lives. So in today's passage, we see Abraham sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. They say that the weather goes up to like 65 degrees Celsius during the hottest time of the day in Palestine. So people would usually rest or sleep. Now, Abraham sees three men standing nearby, and one of them is the Lord in human flesh. And in verse 10, you'll read, "Then the Lord said," and Lord is all capital letters. And the other two are God's angels. So God himself appeared to Abraham. However, Abraham did not recognize him. I mean, sure, Abraham calls him my Lord, but again, note that the word Lord is written in lowercase. But I mean, because commonly they call someone higher than you Lord, or wives would call their husbands their lords. So it was a customary thing. But now here we see Abraham treating a complete strangers, right, as if they are his masters. He says, "If I found favor in your eyes, my Lord," right? And he serves them as a servant. And as you all know, Abraham is almost 100 years old by this time. But he bows low to the ground. And he serves choice meals to them, probably the best things he had to offer. And not only that, he prepares water for them to wash their feet, and he waits on their table. And it's not easy to understand why he would treat complete strangers this way. But he does this, and he does his best to meet their needs. And let's see how the book of Hebrews explained this. If you go to the book of Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, it says, Hebrews 13, 1 and 2. "Keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing, some people have entertained angels without knowing it." So clearly, he's referring to Abraham. And Abraham had no idea they were God and the angels, right? He had no idea. He didn't know who they were. And the author of Hebrews defined this act of Abraham as brotherly love, right? Keep loving each other as brothers. So this shows that one of the defining characteristics of God's covenant people, those who are in the covenant of circumcision, is that they entertain strangers, right? And they show brotherly love. And at the latter part of chapter 18, Abraham again does something similar when he intercedes for the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, these are complete strangers. We have seen as early as Genesis 4 how people of the world does exactly the opposite of this, right? They kill each other, they kill others for their own gain. Cain killed Abel, Lamech kills a young boy, right? And this is how sinners live their lives, doing whatever it takes for their own gain. However, God's covenant people do the opposite, and they serve and entertain even strangers with the best things that they have. So God gave his people the laws, right? He gave us the laws. The laws reflect God's character. It says in Romans chapter 7 verse 12, so then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. See? So this reflects God's character. The law of God reflects God's character. And this precisely is the reason why sinners cannot keep them. Because it's good, and we're sinners. Then what then is the law all about? I mean, Jesus summarizes the law, right? In Matthew chapter 20, Matthew 22 verses 36 through 40. Matthew 22 verses 36 through 40. This is what Jesus says. Teacher, so somebody asked, right? Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbors as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So this is what the law is all about. And sin is breaking this law of God. God created us, right, human beings, to love God and to love each other. However, men love themselves too much that they decided to live their lives for their own happiness, their own pleasures, and their own satisfaction and their own glory. See, this is what sin is. But Jesus was cut. Jesus' circumcision was now imputed to his people. Now we carry his circumcision on our body, which means that we have been united with him. And now that we have been restored and renewed through Christ, we get to live a life of loving God and loving our neighbors. So this is what Abraham's story actually shows. I mean, note that the first commandment and the second commandments are inseparable. It says, and the second is like it. And by like it, he means the first. So the first and the second commandment, they go hand in hand. And like Abraham, God, shapes his renewed people to love even complete strangers without any expectation for reciprocation. I mean, Abraham have not met these strangers before, but serves them as his own masters. I mean, these are strangers, right? But he's not even expecting to be compensated. And the reason why he does this is because he was loved by God, and in return, he loves God. And love of God, when you love God, that love of God manifests itself in how you love your neighbors. So how Abraham loved and entertained, right, the complete strangers is a sign that he loved God. So you must understand this to understand many passages of Old Testament. It says, like in Deuteronomy chapter 10, 18 and 19. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 18 and 19, it says, he, God, defends the cause of the fatherless and the widows and loves the aliens, giving him food and clothing. And you are to love those who are aliens, for you yourselves were aliens in Egypt. See, here you find God's command to take care of widows and orphans and aliens or strangers. And these commands appear repeatedly in the Old Testament. And when Israel neglects these commands, God sends his prophets to warn them. Why? Because this is how God transforms those who are in covenant relationship with him. We were once aliens to God too, but God loved us. I mean, he served us and gave his most precious son to us. And now that God saved his people and brought them to the land of Canaan, God expects them to treat aliens the same way God treated them. And when they fail to do this, right, God gives them a stern warning, like in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 4. Jeremiah 7:4. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. So here, Jeremiah is seen doing something that is outrageous. A prophet of God standing in front of the temple gate, crying out, "This people are lying when they call this place a temple of the Lord." And why is he doing this? What is the reason for him doing this? In verse 6, Jeremiah 7 verse 6, "If you do not oppress the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm." See? Now Jeremiah is crying out that this temple is a fake because the Israelites oppressed the aliens and orphans and widows. And if they do not show love, all their sacrifices and temple worship means nothing. They're all fake. So those who understand God's love will love God in return, and those who love God love their neighbors, and even aliens and strangers. And this is where God's grace takes us. In 1 John chapter 4 verse 20 says, 1 John 4:20, "If anyone says, 'I love God,' yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen." You see? So God loved us who had become aliens as neighbors, right? And this is what we must understand. I mean, it is for this reason that we serve God and neighbors in love. I mean, Jesus set a perfect example of how to love neighbors as you love yourself. Right? Jesus loved God, and he loved aliens, strangers, as his neighbors, and gave his life for them. I mean, we are the aliens turned his neighbors, right? He actually gave his life on the cross for us to show his love. And finally, Jesus fulfills all God's law, as the law is all about love. Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 and 10. So Romans 13, 8 and 10, it says, let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. Right? And verse 10, love does not harm to its neighbor. Love does not harm to his neighbors. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. You see? So here, Paul does not even mention, right, love God. He does not even mention the love for God. He singles out, loving fellow men and calls it fulfillments of the law because it is one and the same thing. But the problem is we never loved God nor loved fellow men like Jesus. But Jesus' love, right, his love for God and his love for aliens, his love for neighbors, his love for strangers, all of that love is now counted as ours. That's what circumcision means, right? We carry that death of Christ. It's now applied to us. And in Christ, we too are now considered as though we have fulfilled the law. Then what do? Of course, we must do our best to love aliens as neighbors and love our fellow men. Galatians 5:13 says, it says, you, my brother, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. So we are given freedom, and that is true freedom, right? And what do you do with this freedom? What are we told to do with this freedom that we have? Serve one another in love, you see? So this is exactly what Abraham is doing in today's passage. Now that he's circumcised, right, united with Christ, life of serving others in love is what we see in his life. And because he's the father of faith, we too are expected to follow in his footsteps. And Jesus too came and served even his enemies, right? He even washed the feet of Judas Iscariot. So actually, this is the kingdom way of life. This is how the kingdom citizens of God, right? The kingdom citizens live their lives. In heaven, we will gladly be servants for others. I mean, you might not actually want this, and why would I want to be somebody's servants? But remember, that's how others will serve. That's how others will serve you too. So you'll serve everyone, everyone will serve you. This makes everyone in heaven kings, because everyone serves you and you serve everyone. And this is how we will live for eternity if you belong to the kingdom. So you might as well prepare for it while you're still here. Otherwise, you'll have to spend significant amount of time getting used to it, used to this like new lifestyle, right? So Abraham has never met these strangers. And after they leave, he'll probably never see them again. Because in the ancient times, there were not that many aliens or strangers. Because if you face threats or dangers away from home, you cannot even defend yourself in court. See? So it was not very common to see like strangers or aliens like in your area. But now we see an old man aged 100 serving the strangers and waiting on them and not expecting any compensations whatsoever. Of course, what can he get in return? He'll never see them again. But of course, yeah, sure, we can do some good things here on this earth. We can serve others. But how often do you actually do it without wanting something in return? Right? Almost never, right? Probably. Saints, however, do not expect anything in return. We serve and love simply for the sake of doing it. Because this is how people who are in the covenant of circumcision live their life. And this is what we see in Abraham today. And later you'll read about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're completely different. These are people who are not in the covenant of circumcision, right? And the angels who visited Abraham visited them too, but they were threatened. And you'll read about it, like in chapter 19. The people there wanted to take advantage of the angels. They wanted to take advantage of them for their physical pleasures. Because they thought that these are simply aliens. You might as well just get what you want out of them. So on one hand, we see Abraham serving strangers simply to love them and to serve them. And on the other hand, we see the people of Sodom and Gomorrah like really trying to exploit these strangers for their own gain and pleasures. So this is the difference between the righteous and the wicked. And Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, symbolizes this world. And this is why it deserves judgment. They even try to take advantage of God and His angels for their own gain. So please check carefully if this is what you're doing when you say you serve God. What do you actually expect from your walk of faith? Is it for your own gain here on this earth? If it's not based on love, if it's not for the sake of loving God, if you're doing it, if you're just doing all this, for your like earthly and human expectations, maybe you're doing it wrong. But if you're actually doing it out of love for God, it will manifest in the way you love others, in the way you treat other people. Isaiah 1:17 says, it says, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. You see? Remember how Jesus will judge between the sheep and the goats? And this is what it says in Matthew chapter 25, verses 34 through 40. Matthew 25, verses 34 through 40. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. Right? So here the king's judgment is based on how you treated a stranger. And Abraham did what is right? Because God is teaching his people this through Abraham. Why? Because Abraham is the father of faith. He's our prototype. And this is what and Abraham shows how saints live. And this is actually what we press on towards. We should be able to serve and love the least of the brothers, those whom you cannot benefit from at all. Because without this attitude, you cannot truly love or accept Jesus. I mean, think about it. He did not come as a great king or military general. He did not come as a wealthy, a rich man. He was born in a manger. He grew up as a carpenter's son. He was ridiculed, persecuted, and crucified. I mean, can you actually love him? Can you actually serve him? Because it might appear as if you have nothing to gain from him. He appears to be the least of the brothers. I mean, it's not like your wishes come true when you believe in Jesus, right? Nevertheless, true saints serve the least of the brothers in love, as to Christ himself. So if you serve strangers, right? If you serve strangers, you too become a stranger. Because interestingly, the Bible calls the saints aliens and strangers. And this world will ridicule you and treat you badly. And you might think, if I genuinely love God, if you genuinely love others and serve them, they will see your heart and they will be touched and they'll be moved. No, that's not how the world works. They will laugh at you. They'll try to take advantage of you. And this is why God calls this world evil and wicked. See, remember, this world is governed by the evil forces. That's why we see how Sarah laughed at the strangers too, right? When God made a promise, but she laughed. She thought it did not make any sense. But God promised that he will turn her laughter of derision, right? His laughter of derision into a true laughter of joy. Basically, God is saying, what you laughed, I'll make you really laugh. And if you think about it, during Jesus' time, people laughed at Jesus too. They said, what good can come from Nazareth, right? They thought Jesus was too weak. He was powerless. But Jesus turned their laughter into true joy. And this is the covenant of the cross. I mean, Joseph's brothers laughed when they heard his dream. But they were saved because of Joseph, right? And same was the case when David confronted Goliath. His brothers ridiculed David. But they were delivered through David's victory and became subjects of his kingdom, right? So when we live our lives as strangers, right, the world will laugh at us. Our message might sound ridiculous to them. I mean, this is the 21st century, the age of science and technology. And because of their laughter, they deserve God's judgment. But our duty is to lead them to true joy and laughter, which is salvation, right? Salvation of God. And if you think about it, we too were the ones who laughed at God's promise and salvation, right? I mean, we never took it seriously. But God changed us and expanded his kingdom in us. So do not be afraid to be weak and small by the standards of this world. It has always been that way. But as Paul said, when I'm weak, then I am strong. Why? Because God's power is revealed in your weakness. It's because we live by a different standard. We live differently. I mean, that's what we talked about in the morning. That's what holiness is. And we are to show God's kingdom through our lives. The paradox, though, is that God's kingdom will expand in our weakness. When we serve and love complete strangers, when we become strangers ourselves, we are called as fellow workers of Christ. So we are to bear the same fruit that Jesus bore. You never know when Christ will return. And if you continue to love the least of the brothers, right, and complete strangers, you'll be able to entertain Christ too when He returns. And I know this may be difficult, but this is what characterizes true saints, those who are in God's covenant of circumcision. The Bible teaches us love, a love that is completely different from that of the world. Because remember, loving your neighbors, loving strangers, and the least of the brothers is how you love God. And it is through this love that God's kingdom expands. And God teaches us this through the life of our father of faith, Abraham. And he's the father, right? We are to follow in his footsteps. And it's my prayer that all of us will be able to follow in his footsteps, right? Treat the least of the brothers, strangers and aliens, as neighbors in love, that we may also entertain and please God. So let's close in prayer. Dear Father, we thank you for giving us this time to learn about how the true saints live their life, and how one characteristic of the life of saints is that they love even the least of the brothers and aliens and strangers. Lord, we ask that you would give that heart of Jesus Christ to us as well, that we may be able to truly keep your laws and commands by loving even strangers and even enemies, that your kingdom will be expanded, and that the gospel of Christ may be witnessed in the way we live our lives. Lord, we thank you and you pray in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.